Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And let me extend a particularly warm Carnegie welcome to any viewers who may be tuning in from Europe in the first instance and from Taiwan in the second. This is, in fact, a joint event between the Carnegie Endowment's headquarters in Washington, but our close colleagues at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. And I want to thank both Rosa Balfour, the director, and Lisa Bomasi, the deputy director of Carnegie Europe, for doing this with us today. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment. And our topic today is growing in salience, particularly because of the growing geopolitical turbulence in the world and the growing use of a variety of coercive instruments, not just military action, for geopolitical and political and strategic ends. What we want to talk about today is first coercion of Taiwan, short of war in particular, and second, whether there is room for coordination between the United States and Europe in the first instance, and then between each or both of them with Taiwan in the second. Part of the goal, to be blunt about it, is to encourage a transatlantic discussion of Taiwan. But another is to get people to think more seriously about non-kinetic coercion in particular. I think there's a tendency by some people in Europe to view Taiwan as a distant problem, the security tensions as an American problem, because many in Europe believe or may believe that they lack the more direct American security equities. And in any case, there's insufficient coordination and discussion about the wide array of ways in which Beijing, in particular, could resort to coercive action in Taiwan. So I'm particularly delighted to have such a terrific group joining us. One from Taiwan, one from Europe, one from the United States. From Taiwan, we have Enoch, who's founder and executive director of Forward Alliance, which is a really innovative national security and civil defense think tank. He served on the National Security Council in Taiwan and also has been involved in politics as well. My old friend Gudrun Wacker is one of the most prominent China experts, not just in Germany, but in Europe. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and is a prolific writer on all things China and Taiwan. And Isaac Kardon, my teammate and colleague, senior fellow for China Studies in the Asia program at Carnegie. And team, welcome. Looking forward to this. I'm going to be pretty loose about this. I thought it would be a way to encourage discussion rather than make speeches, but I thought maybe a good place to start would just be to talk a little bit about coercion in general and what we mean by it. My own perspective is that Beijing now has a pretty robust kit bag of tools to play, and we can come back and talk in a more granular way about some of those. But I thought maybe we could start by just going around the horn and having each of you talk a little bit about how you think we should be thinking about coercion in the Taiwan contingency, short of just the binary that we often hear of China invading Taiwan on some supposed timeline that Xi Jinping has come up with. So, Enoch, I thought I'd start with you. Just give us a sense of how you think we ought to be thinking about coercion and contingencies.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Evan. It's great to be with everyone here. I think, we've got esteemed scholars and practitioners here online. What I think I could do here from Taipei is to offer a little bit of perspective on the CCP that we know, the CCP that we see, the CCP that we're living with, that we've been living with for years and decades. I think all of us would likely agree that CCP thinks about dominance, right? And all of their tactics, whether by force or by coercion, whether kinetically or not, I think serve that purpose, right? And so dominance means having this influence and power that I believe it should have, that it rightly deserves, not just in Asia, but globally, as I'm sure everyone is keenly aware by now. And as it relates to Taiwan, I would just add that it means clearly, specifically, unequivocally subjugating Taiwan, right? And so they're a student of strategy, and they certainly found a way to realize this ambition, right? This worldview, without firing a shot. Case in point, certainly is the transformation bit by bit of the South China Sea over the last 10 or so years. And we know that they will continue to test the boundaries of international rules and norms. As far as Taiwan's concerned, to really address your question, Evan, coercion means that they will continue, or their worldview and their approach to world affairs means that they'll continue to work to do two things, right? Within Taiwan, to discredit the Taiwanese government. And that means engaging with the opposition, but not the democratically elected administration. And that means continuing to conduct influence operations to highlight government failures or inadequacies, sometimes based on partial facts, but oftentimes not at all, right? Vaccine failures is an example. Another example is spreading the rumor that the Chinese embassies were doing a better job looking after Taiwanese citizens abroad than our own Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's the first part. So discrediting the government internally within Taiwan, but internationally, I think, which is really more to the point of today's discussion, is to delegitimize Taiwan as a sovereign state, and we see that playing out in our exclusion from important international organs and organizations where we could add tremendous value. WHO is an example. We're just coming out of COVID. I think that's fresh on folks' mind. Whether climate change conferences as well. I mean, you name it, right? Any meaningful, significant international organization has excluded Taiwan's official formal participation. And I think one example I might raise, given that we're doing this across time zones, is the airline industry, which since 2018 has faced tremendous pressure from the Chinese government to treat Taiwan as not a country, but to treat all Taiwanese airports, to label all Taiwanese airports under China. And I think rather than a few, other than a few exceptions, a few U.S. airlines and I believe Italian or maybe the Finnish airlines, I think most European airlines have succumbed to that pressure. I would just add that now this is happening. This coercion is happening not just in the symbolic or information sphere either. Just a couple weeks back, a Chinese Coast Guard boarded Taiwanese passenger vessel traveling between our Kinmen Islands, right, for the first time ever. And I add that last point because I just want to add that while we're talking about scenarios short of war, I worry that as we tackle this problem set, whether kinetically or in the coercion, i.e. short of war context, we may find ourselves in a blind spot by overlooking the fact that the CCP sees themselves very much in conflict, at war. It's a constant struggle they're having within the party, as we're seeing every day in the headlines as well, but also in conflict against the West. So this means that there may not be as fine a line between kinetic and non-kinetic in their mind, as much as we would prefer to see that, or as much as that would be a cleaner way of viewing our problem set. Let me stop there because I think you gave us a warning not to go on into a long rambling speech.
Yeah, but I do want to push you for a second. I'm going to go to Gudrun in a sec, but can you just say a little something about public attitudes and debates in Taiwan about Chinese pressure tactics? How much of it, and this is particularly for the European and American audience, how much is the debate framed around war and issues of war and peace? In other words, it's war and not war. And how much do tactics short of war register with the public and then feed and fuel political debates about either how to respond or, frankly, how to prepare?
Yeah. So I think the tactics short of war are to be honest, they're a part of life, right? I think that's probably the single common experience of every Taiwanese, living Taiwanese, right? Not knowing, starting from your school years, that we're not part of the UN, understanding that our athletes compete internationally, not under our flag, not under our name, but under the strange name of Chinese Taipei, and certainly not to mention, call it the flybys, right? From the PLA Air Force or the increasing the increasingly frequent conflicts in the maritime domain, however we would categorize that. So I think that's a fact of life. And I think for the longest time, the attitude of the average Chinese is that we've accepted that the world will view Taiwan as almost as a for a long time the world has viewed Taiwan as an inconvenience, right, in its dealings with China, and for market access, for whatever reason, Taiwan will have to take a back seat because let's grow the economy and China will liberalize. We'll deal with it when the time comes. And the problem is, during this whole time, China has been successfully changing the status quo bit by bit because we were all willing to take a step back and to accommodate. And so now, you asked earlier, how does the public view this choice or this between war and peace? Honestly, politically, it's a tough one because as you can imagine, every democratic government has an interest in maintaining stability, in not alarming the public, and so Taiwan has had to strike this perfect balance between enhancing our defense, enhancing our awareness of the threat, without giving a single inch, without giving the perception that we are we're in any way provoking or calling for a conflict. And it's a tricky situation to find yourself in when defending yourself can be interpreted or manipulated as being provocative.
Okay, good. Gudrun, I want to turn to you and see if you can talk a little bit in the first instance about European perspectives and experiences with coercion in general before we drill down on Taiwan per se. I mean, just contextually, there's a lot of experience in the Russia context, Russia using energy exports as a weapon and so on. There's a growing body of experience in the China context. We can point to Lithuania as one example, which has a Taiwan connection, but there's a broader body of experience, Norway and salmon exports and so on. And then there's the counter-coercion bill and other legislation, both at the national and at the Brussels level, that's been debated and is obviously shaping debates. So first, give us a sense of how Europeans are thinking about non-kinetic coercion, and then to the extent that you can connect it to the way Europeans are thinking about Taiwan and their interests, do that for us too.
I think you're right. I mean, Europe, the EU, and individual member states mainly have been the target of coercion or efforts to coerce us into doing something or other, or not do something or change something, not only by China, but also by Russia. And I have to say, under Donald Trump, I would even include the United States as one of the governments that try to coerce us to do things, on Huawei, for example, for the right or wrong reasons. So we are the target, and there is a lot of thinking about it, especially in the areas of disinformation, so the new areas, less the direct economic ones, where, for example, in the case of Norway, this was a widely publicized case when the Chinese refused to import salmon from Norway because they gave the Peace Nobel Prize to the wrong kind of person. But in the end, these measures didn't really bite, not the economic ones. So there is probably more concern now in the debate about disinformation, cyber attacks, and the coercion that is not publicized. And Enoch mentioned the example of airlines being pressured, companies being pressured, hotel chains, because they display the wrong kind of map in their brochure or whatever. And you don't even know these cases if they don't happen to come under public scrutiny. And often the companies then cave because they say, okay, our China business, for example, is more important for us. So I would say, because economic coercion and boycotts, for example, it's easier to counter them. Like Norway can say, okay, we sit it out. In the case of Lithuania, which was very interesting because Lithuania made this decision to allow Taiwan to open an office with the name Taiwan in the title. And this angered the Chinese. And I think the problem was that China then not only sanctioned Lithuania and said we will not import goods from Lithuania, but also goods from other European countries that use Lithuanian parts or components. And then the EU swung into action. At the time, we did not have the anti-coercion instrument in place. So the only way to go was go to the WTO. Now we do have the anti-coercion instrument. It's finalized. I think it entered force now. But I have to remind you, this will only bite if a European member state, a EU member state, is the target of the coercion. So it's not about third countries being targeted. And to talk about Taiwan, I mean, in your introduction, you said people are very focused on this peace war kind of black and white picture. And I don't like that very much. But it's a fact that in Europe, the debate about Taiwan was very much pushed by this, this idea that war is on the table, invasion of Taiwan is on the table. I think it started with this article in The Economist, most dangerous place on earth. And then there were several statements from high-ranking military people in the US that talked about timelines for this invasion. But then for Europeans, I think more important for the debate was the war in Ukraine, because especially in Eastern European countries, in the Baltic states, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, immediately people drew the parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. And so this idea, nobody had expected Russia to do a full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and out of a sudden this happened. So it became a much more realistic scenario to think about Taiwan within the same framework. And then you have the chance to start the debate about what is happening now. And if we talk about the toolbox of the Chinese, we see it in full play in Taiwan, while other countries see part of these instruments at play, the economic one, the disinformation, the influence, the cyber attacks. This is around, and I think Taiwan sees the full range of the toolbox in play. And there is one measure that only plays out in the case of Taiwan, and that's trying to shrink the international space for Taiwan.
I want to drill down on the toolkit a little bit, but maybe I should go to Isaac first, and then we come back on that. Isaac, I know I know because we're colleagues, you're actually involved in a lot of scenario exercises and things like that that go on in think tanks. And I don't need you to talk about that, but I wonder if you can just give us a sense of the state of the American discussion as you see it. Again, to use Gudrun's phrase, beyond this issue of war and peace. I mean, I sometimes joke, I'm American, we're very simple people. We tend to think in binaries. So, it's war or peace. If it's going to be war, it's invasion or not invasion. And meanwhile, as Gudrun was just implying, China has spent 20 to 25 years building up a kit bag of 375 ways to put the squeeze on in order to influence choices and behaviors and then shape outcomes. How much of that is part of the American debate now? Who's having the debate? Is it the political class? Is it just the strategic class? Is it the military? How much does the Indo-PACOM get into non-kinetic scenarios? Just to give us a sense of the state of the American discussion as you see it.
Sure. Well, as you know, I've been straddling this divide between war and peace, having come from the Naval War College and here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I think a lot about that in dialectical terms, having studied Chinese literature and writing on this. I think the discussion in Washington and in and around our defense community, as you note, Evan, has tended to be fixated on that kind of bright black and white distinction. And the set piece is this idea that a major amphibious operation to seize and hold the island of Taiwan is in the offing, whether there's a timeline for it or not. That's sort of the pacing challenge, as we've heard from the Defense Department. And I think there is an increasing awareness and recognition of a lot of the activities and Beijing's use of this toolkit that Enoch and Gudrun have discussed, and more interest and more discussion about some of the actions that Beijing has taken below the threshold of armed conflict. And yet, because of our simplicity as Americans and our kind of aversion maybe to dialectical reasoning, there tends to be a dismissal of these kind of lower end threats. It's a little bit more difficult to think about from the standpoint of defense policy, posture. This notion of deterrence tends to revolve around deterring a specific act. And I guess I may take the opportunity to offer just a little bit of an academic gloss on what we're talking about when we mean coercion. Typically, people view both deterrence and compellence as sort of the main subsets of coercion. And it has to do with, in the case of deterrence, preventing or dissuading, rather, an adversary from doing something that they would otherwise do, or compellence, which is to say forcing them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, looking at this toolkit and looking at some of the operational measures that Beijing is employed, particularly in the maritime domain where I've been most focused, you see a lot. You see something that's not a mirror image, but is using the same words as the United States debate, which is to say deterrence. The main PRC goal, such as I understand and can observe it in their behavior, has much more to do with deterring the permanent separation of the island of Taiwan from China. And I think that distinction has not there hasn't been much uptake of that in DC, in particular because of the fixation on timelines and because of the sort of vivid imagination that we have about all the many components of a major amphibious invasion to seize Taiwan. It's much more difficult to wrap our heads around, well, what can you do to prevent China from preventing Taiwan from achieving its independence? And I think you run into this problem in Washington, which is that there hasn't been, we maintain an ambiguous posture. It's quite clear that the United States, as a matter of policy, does not support the independence of Taiwan. And so I think we're a bit wrong-footed in the discussion in a lot of ways. And it's difficult to interpret actions like Enoch raised, boarding of civilian Taiwanese vessels in and around territorial waters of Jinmen, for example, which is on the west side of the Taiwan Strait, quite close to Xiamen, and certainly within the area of operations that the Chinese Coast Guard and other maritime law enforcement see. So I don't want to go on too long other than to maybe kick it back to you, Evan, as someone much more experienced in Washington, and ask whether or not that characterization is correct from your standpoint. I do, as you said, sit in a lot of rooms in discussions about precisely this subject. And I think there's an effort underway, and I'm trying to be a part of that, of trying to think with a little bit more nuance about what we're actually seeing from Beijing. And I think, absent some dramatic change in the strategy that we've seen from Beijing over these 75 years, the expectation ought to be continuation rather of this coercive strategy that prizes deterrence, that prizes finding ways to demonstrate to Taiwan that the costs of taking further steps towards independence are not worth the squeeze. And I think that it's that kind of fine distinction that it has frustrated a lot of our finest minds here in thinking about what can practically be done to prevent these, what are sometimes called, salami slicing, or kind of gradual and incremental efforts to diminish Taiwan's international space, to make the world, as Enoch said, view Taiwan's behavior as an inconvenience, and to cease supporting its de facto autonomy.
Gudrun, could I go back to you? I mean, the underlying theme of this is transatlantic coordination and discussion jointly, but potentially also separately, both in terms of preparing and responding, but also in terms of coordination with Taiwan itself. I was struck by the way you talked about the connection between Taiwan and Ukraine in European minds, because I think for a lot of European publics, the connection of Ukraine to European security equities would be much more direct, much more direct. Russia sharing borders with European countries, Ukraine sharing borders with European countries, basically the entire European security order appearing to collapse into something in the wake of February 2022. And I don't want to say Taiwan is distant, because it's important to the global economy. It's a trading partner. There's certain industries like chips and semiconductors where it's meaningful, but European countries individually and collectively don't have the American security history with Taiwan itself. First, because the Republic of China had been a treaty ally of the United States before the US normalized relations with Beijing and changed that. But second, because the US has a direct military presence in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific, with bases that would become central to military contingency planning. So when you think about it from a Berlin perspective or a Brussels perspective, how much is Taiwan imprinted into the European strategic calculus at this point? Because I can see the case, if somebody says, oh, there's a war, two nuclear powers, the United States and China, of course it matters to the world. But when we get into things that are below the threshold of war, and particularly non-kinetic types of coercion, how much does this, number one, register? Second, how much does it cross-cut European strategic interests? And just, does it matter in Europe enough to jumpstart not just a conversation, but actual action?
Okay, let me start by explaining why Ukraine and Taiwan are connected from the perspective mainly of these Eastern European states. It's the close friendship between Russia and China that really concerns people. So it's sort of an indirect, basically saying Russia and China are the same. And just as Russia invaded Ukraine, China will at some point invade Taiwan. That's the connection. And it doesn't translate into any actions immediately, but in a general sympathy for Taiwan to see it in the same basket, so to speak. I mean, if you ask me, the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan end almost at the point where you say big bad neighbor threatens small democratic nice country. You know, there are a lot of differences, but from the perspective of the people who feel directly threatened by Russia, this close relationship between Russia and China makes the difference. Now, for your second part of the question, or the real question you asked, I have a very bleak view of the European Union, European member states, and how big Taiwan does figure on the radar screen or not. Because you saw during the 8 years of Ma Ying-jeou being the president of Taiwan, that the Europeans basically fell into a coma. They were happy, you know, that the status quo was stable, looked stable, that there was dialogue. Europeans are always for dialogue between the two sides. There were these agreements. So they basically fell into a coma compared to the two presidencies of Chen Shui-bian from 2000 to 2008. And then they woke a little bit up when Tsai Ing-wen was elected, and China went back to this, you know, coercion, gray zone activity policy. But I think the difference now is that you see Taiwan in official documents. I should also explain there is a divide between the executive branch and the parliaments. Parliaments in Europe are traditionally friendly to Taiwan for whatever reason. Most European parliaments and parliaments of member states have a friendship group. And now in Germany, we even, at the subnational level, we have friendship groups with Taiwan. So this is the tradition. The executive is much more cautious for the reasons that Enoch already hinted at. The executive doesn't want Taiwan to interfere, so to speak, with our relations with China. So for the parliaments, it figures more prominently traditionally, but that also doesn't mean much in terms of action. But what you see over the last years, and not only the war in Ukraine, but also COVID and this whole thinking about supply chains and supply chain security has led to this. You see that Taiwan is in the official documents. There are more statements. There are resolutions by the European Parliament. There are more visits, even addressing the coercive measures. There was a first ever official delegation from the European Parliament to Taiwan by this group that focuses on disinformation and cyber attacks. So this is all new, but there are other things that haven't changed. And that's the One China policy is the framework for all European member states. And there are also some other things that have not really changed in the attitude. So I think because we now have an Indo-Pacific strategy, Germany has the Indo-Pacific guidelines, that it's more on the radar screen, but it doesn't figure prominently in the strategic thinking.
So I want to go back to Enoch on two things. One is views of Europe from Taiwan, and second is on the Chinese kickback. But Gudrun, I do want to just ask as a follow-up, how much have lessons from dealing with Russia in Ukraine, either in the run-up to or since February 2022, informed these debates about Taiwan? How much is there a direct connection, not just at the strategic level, the way you laid it out, which is that there's a connection in the strategic mindset between Russia and China, between Ukraine and Taiwan, and so on, but rather the lessons that are being learned about how to deal with the whole panoply of tools that Moscow has used? How much of that is forming prior debates about what Europeans might do in the Taiwan contingency?
Well, first of all, of course, that the debate we are in the middle of this debate, because obviously our way to deal with Russia has not worked at all. We believed that we had found an architecture in Europe, that will safeguard security, that will prevent war. And now we know otherwise. And we see certain things like strategic or critical dependencies in a very different light now. I mean, there was opposition to Nord Stream 2 in many quarters of Germany, and we didn't listen to any of the other European countries who said this is a stupid idea. We insisted on doing it anyway, because there was still this belief that somehow economic interdependencies are a stabilizing factor for political relations, and they will heighten the threshold for using open force to get your goals. So the debate we are having now in Europe and in Germany, especially because we were probably the most appeasing country, if you will, vis-a-vis Russia, is exactly that. How do we prevent escalation? What is something like, the scissors in your own head, and how does this apply to China? So the debate about Russia is also relevant in the context of how do we deal with China, and you see that in the German China strategy, although it's still a paper full of delusionary thinking, where we can get China to join some international mechanisms or whatever. But there is a lot of thinking has already gone into the China strategy.
So, how is Europe viewed by the strategic class in Taiwan? I mean, when you think about partnerships, or people in Taiwan think about partnerships, I don't mean if there's an invasion. I don't mean, because I mean, Gudrun, feel free to disagree with me, but the chances of Europeans sending troops or ships or planes, it's basically, it's nil. Right, it's nil. But that doesn't mean Europe should be irrelevant to Taiwan's calculus. So flip to Taipei and give us a sense of how Europe fits into the strategic calculus. And then maybe you can use that as a way to slide into the kit bag a little bit, and how you, what tools Beijing might lean on, where you think Europe might become a more relevant part of the equation.
Yeah, I'll give it a try, certainly, and just steer me back towards on point if you feel that I'm sort of missing the core key question here. First, just how Taiwan views Europe. I hope I don't come off flippant by saying, we're working off of pretty low base, right? And so certainly things that we've talked about on this call so far have been quite constructive and helpful in the last few years, right? Countries, Lithuania was raised as an example just now, that have taken an actual stand in not just what's economical, but what is right? And the EU rallying behind them. I think what we saw from the European Parliament not too long ago, at least voicing this collective security outlook, that's also a welcoming movement. Folks at least voicing support for a country and its people's right to self-determination. I think these are universal values that every democracy should care about. I would be foolish to talk to a group of Europeans and Americans about the danger of assuming that an autocratic, rising nationalistic power is purely seeking assurance, and this is the only, and they won't go further than here. Right, we see that playing out throughout obviously European history. Currently, it's happening now as we speak in real time, and so I think we're but against the backdrop of what Taiwan has had to deal with in the last few decades, it's certainly quite it's certainly much appreciated. Now, but we understand we understand obviously that every government still has to try to make a balance and balance short-term economic interest with longer term security, and it's not an easy choice. What I would say about the tool bag, the kit bag that we're discussing here, I'll just stress again that the CPP is after a political end, right? A political outcome, and anything and everything that would help it achieve that outcome, I think is fair game. And so that's why certainly we see IO, we see information work, we see cyber attacks, but we also see them more than willing to go into the physical realm, right? And so I know that the focus of the military is not the focus of this discussion today, but I just like to stress that that's very much in the toolkit. They continue to invest in that capability, making sure that those tools are available, and that investment, that work took place over the last 25 plus years, even when Ma Ying-jeou was leading the government, right? Even when they were engaging in dialogue with the KMT between 2000 and 2016. So I think from Taiwan's perspective, we can't assume this is a non-kinetic problem only, and that China's only seeking to resolve our differences through methods short of war. I would point out, why do I stress that? I stress that because the goal here is political, right? And over the last few decades, all these maneuvers have not brought Taiwan closer towards that political outcome that the CCP, that Beijing is seeking, right? Official diplomatic partners, as we all know here on the call, they're heading towards zero, right? That should not be a surprise to anyone. And then what, right? That is not winning Taiwanese hearts and minds. And so something's got to give eventually. And if we, I think it's only prudent to be very concerned about that worst case scenario, right? If coercion fails, right? If pressure fails, if all this fails, continues to fail, I should say, then what is left, right? And so that's why we must, from here, we must prepare for that worst case scenario and what is happening real time right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And important to stress. I mean, from my perspective, as I was trying to set up at the beginning, I think the issue is to get away from binaries in general. So the point is not that there's a binary between kinetic and non-kinetic. It's that in a world where there's a lot of planning going on for kinetic contingencies, we're at some risk of having other tools in the kit bag and preparation to deal with them drop out of the discussion. And so that's actually a segue to Isaac. I mean, I'll put two bald-faced propositions on the table. Okay, one is that for China, for Beijing, coercion of Taiwan, as it's sometimes said, it's not an event, it's a process, right? If you think it's an event is a one-time thing. It's like a day. And so the analogy you use is it's June 6, 1944, and tanks come rolling up the beaches. Because if it's an event, you get one shot at it. But if it's a process, it means you can ratchet up and back, you can mix and match the tools, that this is going to go on until, as Enoch just said, the outcome that's desired is arrived at. And then second, is another proposition that Beijing's objective is to achieve the outcome it seeks, but obviously at the lowest possible cost to itself. And so the high-end kinetic scenarios are very much a part of the picture, but are the very antithesis of that proposition, right? Because they could achieve the outcome, but at extremely high cost, which is not to say they're not part of the picture, but there's other things in the kit bag available. So if you think that's right, and that they will mix and match, it's a process, they can ratchet up and back, it's a whole of regime strategy across financial, economic, diplomatic, political, and military. How prepared is the United States to deal with that? Because I think their assumption on the other side is that the intensity of fervor is with them, and that they can continue this pretty much indefinitely, and that there'll be a problem for the United States and others of sustaining public interest, sustaining commitment to the fight, whatever you mean by fight, because fight can mean non-military. So walk us through that a little bit, unless you do or disagree with the propositions.
I don't I don't differ with either of those propositions, and I think they're consistent with this whole discussion here. And certainly, the coercion of Taiwan is clearly a process because we've been watching it unfold over the entire period of the PRC's existence. They have had varied levels of intensity of how they've applied that coercion. They've developed, as Enoch importantly points out, a variety of high end as well as low end tools, tactics, and ways of causing some pain to Taiwan. And I think just translating this into the Washington discussion, thinking of China's coercion of Taiwan as a process rather than an event is precisely the challenge. It's easy to organize around this idea that there will be a bolt from the blue and there will be some major obvious event, as you suggest, that would clearly galvanize our defense community, but potentially even population in the United States and around the world with some clearly unprovoked unilateral excessive use of force. It's much more difficult for us to envision a sort of passive or a slow or uncertain or unsteady response from the U.S. and its allies. But if we're watching this movie, as all of us here are, and many sophisticated watchers of Asia have done for some time, it's quite clear that the desired ending of this movie from Beijing's standpoint is this happy ending where they gain the island at the lowest possible cost, as you propose. And what that amounts to in simple terms is that Taiwan comes out with its hands up. They've seen the futility of trying to generate, this is the Beijing perspective, of trying to generate an international coalition and legitimacy as a sovereign state, and recognize that the costs outweigh the benefits of maintaining that status. And I think that is precisely the problem from the standpoint of generating this kind of transatlantic or just more broadly multilateral way of countering coercion, because you put two specialists in a room and you'll find 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of interpreting what Beijing is doing. It's very difficult to kind of hold all the many tools in the toolkit in one's mind at a time and recognize how they interact. Or just to pick up on Enoch's point that we shouldn't neglect, even if we're talking about non-military coercion, the presence of military capability. Having watched this in practice for a long period of time in places like the South China Sea, East China Sea, and increasingly in the Taiwan Strait, what we see is looking for those thresholds at which it's not going to be clear and obvious, certainly to the United States, that China's breached the peace, has crossed some obvious red line, and created a clear cause for international support for Taiwan, but rather making it look like China is incrementally expanding the scope of its control, of its ability to dominate this space, as we've discussed. And each marginal and incremental step in that direction, it's very difficult to have that be the catalyst for some major reckoning with what's going on. Back to this idea of gradually expanding Coast Guard patrols around Jinmen and starting to interdict Taiwanese vessels. Now, if you were to scale that up and envision that happening, say in the territorial seas around the main island of Taiwan, you could imagine that would generate a lot of concern. Or if the overflights out across the median line and into the air defense identification zone start to gradually infringe on Taiwanese airspace. These are the sorts of activities that, again, if we're watching this movie, we should expect to see. We've seen a gradual progression of it. And what military demonstrations accomplish, and we again have sort of seen it operationally, is it's this over the horizon, high end threat that's meant to backstop these smaller, non-kinetic, less individually provocative events. And I think that's sort of the nature of the problem set. We're gonna have to hold a couple things in our mind at once as we look at this. We can't go to sleep on the idea that there is a potential for a bolt from the blue, but in some ways that's precisely what Beijing intends to accomplish. It's that if we're fixated on that one outcome that would be easy to figure out a response to, not easy from an operational standpoint, but at least strategically unacceptable, and possibly even to many U.S. allies and partners as well, then it's not that complicated a problem. But I think, unfortunately, that is not the world we're living in.
So here, pull that thread. So let's like air defense. You said air defense identification zone. Lots of commercial airliners from Europe, Gudrun, fly to. I think there are flights to Taiwan. Same thing. I mean, yeah, I think United flies there. There's American Airlines. So imagine. Not an aviation law expert, but unless I'm wrong about this, imagine, for example, that Beijing declares its own air defense identification zone encompasses the entire island of Taiwan and what Taiwan regards as sovereign airspace, and therefore now requires pre-notification to Chinese authorities of all flights through the ADIZ. So my presumption is that commercial airliners in general would respect that because they would worry about getting shot down, but military aircraft might not, and indeed the United States and others might want to challenge that directly with military flights and dare China to do something about it. Am I wrong about that? I mean, just pull the thread on a scenario where you think U.S. and European interests are implicated, and tell me what you think can be done to prepare for that.
Okay, I think I want to get away from this military encroachment of China. I think there are some lower hanging fruit where we could probably start. One is on language. What China is trying to do at the moment is declaring that the one China principle is a universally accepted formula. And this is because of resolution, 1758, which fixed the status of Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China once and for all. I think this is a small step, but we could all start to push back on this kind of narrative. So I think language is very important. And what China is trying to do at the UN level, for example, is rolling out these narratives that Taiwan status is clear.
Have Europeans not done so?
What?
Have Europeans not done so? Because I mean, Americans have pushed that back. I mean, we hear all the time in
yes,
Washington.
We repeat
one
the
China policy, not
over,
one China principle.
over and over again. But I have to say, until a few years ago, I remember there was one Greek foreign minister who said to a Chinese visiting minister, "We have the one China principle." So you have to, you have to educate. You have to have the debate in the European Union, so that even small countries that have not the capacity of the German foreign ministry in terms of China expertise to be exact about these things. And there the Americans could also help. So I'm trying to think of low-hanging fruit, because the problem with these military cyber attacks, disinformation, I think on disinformation we can learn a lot from Taiwan, because it's actually educating. There are several NGOs that are educating the citizens how to debunk disinformation. But on the military stuff, the exercises, I think China is going beyond trying to deter Taiwan to move to independence. They want to undermine the Taiwanese people's trust in the government and wear it out to a point where it throws up its arms and says, okay, resistance is obviously futile, we throw in the towel. That's the goal from my perspective.
Right.
And if you do it in the way they do it, and they did in the South China Sea, the problem is if you intervene at some point as a third party, you overreact, basically, as long as they stay underneath a certain threshold of using force, right? And we saw how this plays out in the South China Sea, because you reach a point of no return, where the salami slicing has sliced the whole salami. And I think it's much harder to come up with, except for statements for, I read this somewhere, assertive transparency. So publicizing, and mapping these activities, and be, so that you can mobilize more international support and more statements. But I don't see that you can do much more.
Do you think Europeans would and or could respond to coercive measures that are more in the economic realm? So you said, let's get away from these military. So using policies, quotas, or licenses to embargo, for example, entire product categories from Taiwan, which is clearly not WTO compliant. Taiwan's a WTO member. Or punishing any third-party company that also does business of any kind with Taiwan. So you have American companies, for example, including very prominent American companies that are on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. They do business in mainland China, they do business in Taiwan. I can imagine the scenario where Beijing says, you want to keep doing business in China, just end your business in Taiwan. That could easily happen to European companies, because I know European companies that fit that category too. Or a blockade scenario. For example, we have a question in the chat from a viewer about how Europeans and Americans might respond or coordinate for a blockade scenario. A blockade, it uses military instruments, but it has big economic implications for the global economy. So would Europeans respond to any of those, or could they?
I have to say, I feel that our appetite for sanctions, and we look at Russia and how our sanctions, and these are the most drastic sanctions we have ever used, but they have not killed the Russian economy. They have not changed the mind of Putin. And vis-a-vis China, we already have sanctions because of Xinjiang. It's very targeted to people who were directly involved in the labor camps in Xinjiang. And of course, China retaliated. So the first question is, would you discuss this at the EU level? I think the member states would probably push, say the EU should do that and not the individual member states. And I can see that the EU would respond with economic sanctions, maybe, but it's gonna be very hard to find unity, because in contrast to Ukraine, there is no unity within the European Union on the Taiwan issue. For some member states, this is a non-issue. And you heard even Macron making these remarks when he visited the last time China. On the way back, he said, it's far away, and why should we follow the United States? So it's gonna be very hard, but I hope that there is contingency planning on the way behind closed doors. But I think, again, this would probably, there have been some transatlantic scenario workshops in the past. We should probably pick that up again and probably not talk about military contingencies, but about, can we find an anti-salami slicing tactic that is actually promising?
Yeah. So Enoch, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, if I may. Now, I think, I think we all see how economic measures have a limited effect on an autocracy that honestly has a political goal, and one which is not as responsive to economic pain, right? And so I would offer that the counter to salami slicing, we have to address the intended outcome. And what I mean is, for every, there has to be an offset for every act for every belligerent act that is attempting to change the status quo, that continues to attempt to slice the salami, right, as it were. So for every inch that they take in international space, we need to restore that space elsewhere. right? Otherwise, it's ineffective, right? Because again, I think we just highlighted why it hasn't worked, and I don't see why attempting the same thing would I don't see how that would change in the future. And so what I mean is, for every act that delegitimizes Taiwan, that continues to shrink our international space, there needs to be a reciprocal act that helps to enhance our presence on the world stage, right? And that these consequences, these reactions must be clearly communicated in advance, so that they're not. The point is not to impose costs, because clearly they view costs differently than us, but it's to offset their effects. Now that all that assumes that there's political will in the first place, which is just the last point that was raised, and that's something that I can't, unfortunately, I cannot comment on.
Yeah, the mainland maybe, Beijing may be risk tolerant, but they're not risk oblivious. And since we've been talking about Russia and Ukraine, there is one data point that's relevant, which is, I would suppose that the reason they have not opened the taps for Russia, despite the fact that there's political support for Russia, is because they have quite a bit to lose. So it's not that sanctions have collapsed the Russian economy, or the exposure to sanctions has convinced Chinese entities to do nothing with Russia. But it's quite clear that there's absolutely nothing that China does with Russia that is more important to them, broadly speaking, and in the great scheme of things, than market access to the global economy. If the opposite were true, they presumably would have opened the taps completely. And the fact that they haven't done it suggests that we might caveat that a little bit by saying that integration into the global economy can, in fact, be a point of vulnerability. And so as we think about counter-coercion, leveraging that point of vulnerability ought to be part of the strategic conversation that we're having in order to shape Chinese behavior as well, right?
So two things, if I may push back a little. Sure. One is the if we look at how the Beijing government handled COVID and the way they locked down the country, and it would suggest that they are able to at least their pain threshold might be higher than we like to think. And then secondly, though, to your point, actually, is that measures that we've seen that them take to insulate their economy from potential economic sanctions would suggest that they might be indeed. I guess that speaks to your point, but that they're preparing for that outcome, right? That potential.
Okay, so we're just about at time, so I want to just do a quick round robin and ask each of you in like 30 seconds to just give me your sense on the transatlantic conversation. Isaac, Gudrun, and then Enoch closing us out. If you were designing, I'm very attracted to this idea of ramping up a kind of scenario planning, contingency planning discussion. Where would you focus that? What are kind of the top three things you think Americans and Europeans together, but also maybe even trilaterally, ought to be focusing on in this space? So we'll go Isaac, Gudrun, Enoch, and then we'll bring it home. Isaac.
I think, I take Enoch's points and yours, Evan, and I think it's an interesting tension as to assessing just how much Beijing is willing to pay extraordinary economic costs for this stake. And I think from a transatlantic perspective, that's sort of the crux of our potential for cooperation, is recognizing the globalized economic costs of even coercive measures short of attempting to seize the island. And so thinking, from a sector standpoint, I think really focusing on shipping and transportation and trying to get a common understanding across the Atlantic among the major players in industry about some of the scenarios, having some more realistic ideas about the ways that China, short of using force, which would entirely change the equation, short of using force, can really impose major economic costs, not just on Taiwan, but on the global economy. And I think that's really the ballast that's going to help stabilize and perhaps create a fruitful transatlantic dialogue on Taiwan issues.
Gudrun, where do you want to see the transatlantic dialogue go?
There are already some trilateral formats done. For the last 2 years in Brussels, there was a conference, and before that in Berlin. So there are some formats where the US, the European Union, and Taiwan are involved and where this is a topic. We attended the one of Reinhard Bütikofer. It's not transatlantic in nature. It's more for the European audience. I think the blockade or quarantine scenario would be a good one, a good starting point, because there is this study of the Rhodium Group about the tremendous fallout of any blockade, even if no third party nor Taiwan does anything about it. The implications for the global economy are horrendous. So this is probably a good starting point, including if you want to bring some, I don't know, shipping companies into the conversation, because I know that some of our companies are starting, this is due diligence, they're making evacuation plans and stuff like that, but that's all of course, for a military conflict scenario. So I think this would be a good idea as a starting point. And then the language thing is pushing back the narrative from my perspective is also very important too, and that could be done easily in coordination.
Okay, so Enoch, I'm going to give you the last word. Where do you hope this conversation will go, either trilaterally or between Americans and Europeans?
So I agree with everything that was said. I would add three things to my wish list. One is a study into how we might put in place some de-escalation mechanism in the area through a multinational security presence. And I say that in the context of for the first time ever, our Coast Guards, respective Coast Guards, coming as close to face as they've ever been in a non-cooperative way. And as Isaac said, we've seen this movie before. We're seeing it play out in real time, and we know where it's headed. And so it's important that the sooner that there's a international commitment to maintaining peace and stability in the region, whether it's freedom of operation, freedom of navigation, or otherwise, I think that's an important statement, an important direction. I think the second point, that's something that we haven't really discussed internationally, is the counters to this to the political effects that the CCP has been quite successful in imposing on Taiwan, right? Shrinking of our international space and taking away our legitimacy. And to the extent that there is political will, that is a big if. I think it's important. The only way to counter that is to clearly communicate that every aggressive act would be compensated and reciprocated, not against China, but in elevating Taiwan in a similar offsetting fashion. Third, actually, I'd actually look further. I would say international will and solidarity in supporting Ukraine. It's not the topic today, but I have to point out that there's nothing that emboldens the CCP more than seeing international support waver where is most important now.
All right, great. Well, this is a topic that deserves a lot more conversation, and I'm glad you got prescriptive a little bit at the end. So it won't be the last time we do this at Carnegie. So it's just for me to thank the three of you, thank the audience for their time, thank our colleagues at Carnegie Europe in Brussels for helping us to organize this, and to wish everybody a very good morning from here in the United States. Good evening to Enoch, and we look forward to more conversation on this. Thanks, everybody.